So someone called me anti-Semitic the other day. Me, anti-Semitic? For what? Exposing how the Israelis hate Semitic Arabs and how they treat Semitic Ethiopian Jews like absolute garbage? Or for simply stating facts that lead to the systematic discrimination of Gentiles, like Jewish people control Hollywood? It's a sad state of affairs when a pro-Semitic activist like myself can be labeled anti-Semitic and then discriminated against for a false notion of the phrase. Perhaps Jewish people need a refresher course on what the term anti-Semitic actually means. A Semitic person includes any ancient or modern Semitic-speaking peoples in Southeast Asia, basically the Middle East. Arabs, Hebrews, Canaanites, Phoenicians, Maltese, Semitic-speaking Ethiopians, and a great deal of other peoples are included in this list. To be anti-Semitic means to be against Semitic people, which includes Arabs and some Ethiopians, not just Jewish people, as the anti-Gentile American media would like you to believe. In fact, it could be argued that precluding Arabs from this anti-Semitic rhetoric is actually anti-Semitic because it discriminates against certain Semites, in this case, Arabs. The truth of the matter is that most American, European, and even Israeli Jews aren't really Semites at all. Around 85 to 90% of modern-day Jews are actually descendants of Khazars, which were people located just north of Turkey. Khazars converted to Judaism in the 8th century and subsequently fled Khazaria and migrated into many parts of Europe. There's been some genetic studies done by Jewish scientists that refute this, but those scientists have had their methodologies debunked and their credibility questioned. Common sense alone, though, should tell us that a group of modern-day white people are not going to be Semitic in origin because there weren't any white people in Palestine thousands of years ago, which is why Palestinians and all other Arab neighbors aren't white. Not so coincidentally, modern Jewish people share a very distinct characteristic with the Khazar neighbor, the Armenians. Khazar Jews and Armenians are two of the only people in the world that have extremely large noses. Now, modern-day Jews are also much more similar in skin tone to the Khazar neighbors than to the Palestinians. So how ridiculous to think that two groups who supposedly evolved so close together would have different skin tones and nose sizes, but one of those groups would share those similarities with a group not neighboring Palestine. Well, a Jewish historian, Arthur Koestler, researched the history of the Ashkenazi Jews and published a book titled The 13th Tribe, which basically explains this. And he concluded that the origins of these Jews is actually just north of Turkey, where the Khazars were. Historical records and common sense provide conclusive evidence that most modern-day Jews are the descendants of Khazars, and therefore not Semites. By the way, 100% of this information comes from numerous Jewish sources. I use about 95% of all my sources for all of my activism comes from Jewish sources. Now, by definition, Jewish Americans and Jewish Israelis are the most anti-Semitic people in the world today, as evidenced by their own admission and their actions. The Association for Civil Rights in Israel, ACRI, took a poll in 2007 which found that 66% of Israeli teens believe Arabs are less intelligent, uncultured, and violent. 50% of the Israelis taking the poll said they would not share an apartment with an Arab, they would not befriend an Arab or let their kids befriend Arabs, or even let Arabs into their own homes. A poll taken by the ACRI in 2008 found that these trends were actually increasing. Another poll, taken in 2007 by the Center Against Racism, found that 75% of Israeli Jews did not approve of Jews living in the same apartment buildings as Arabs, and that more than 50% of Jews would not have an Arab boss and thought that it was tantamount to national treason to marry an Arab. 50% of Israelis also thought that Arabs should not be allowed in the same entertainment sites, and 40% wanted Arabs' voting rights rescinded. So just for a little history and a background, when black African Jews returned to Israel in 1969 under the Right of Return Act, the government ruled that they were not real Jews and therefore did not qualify for citizenship or any legal status. The black Hebrews were also denied state benefits and work permits. It wasn't until 2003 that the black Hebrews were granted permanent residency, but not the automatic citizenship granted to all the races returning under the exact same provision. If it wasn't for a group of Americans who shamed the Israeli government into granting black African Jews some legal status, they probably would have never received it. To this day, black Jews are still not accepted by the Jewish community in Israel. Racial slurs, insults, and discrimination in housing rentals are commonplace. And this treatment has reached such an unbearable level that Semitic Ethiopian Jews have taken to the streets to protest. In response to the protests, Sofa Lanver, the Israeli immigrant absorption minister, smugly replied that they should be grateful for all that Israel has done for them. Now this is, if you notice, very reminiscent of white supremacist rhetoric in America, which claims that Africans should be grateful their ancestors brought them to America. Israel was clearly created under the premise of future safety for all Jews, not just white European Jews, as the Israeli government would like to believe. Therefore, black African Jews should have the exact same rights and entitlements to Israel as any other Jews. The Israeli government has even been caught attempting to sterilize Semitic Ethiopian Jews by giving them a controversial birth control, Depo-Provera, without warning them of any of the potential side effects, which are severe. Ethiopian Jews are less than 1% of the population in Israel, but yet they account for 60% of the women on Depo-Provera. The side effects, as I said, are quite severe, including pain in the hands and back, heavy bleeding, and in some cases permanent sterilization. Around 10% of the women taking this drug develop substantial side effects, which is why in 2004 the FDA warned against the dangers of the drug. Unfortunately, many Ethiopian Semitic Jews fear being deported if they speak up about these types of abuses, so they remain silent. I think the ADL and other Jews need to be taught what anti-Semitism and racism are all about. You can't be racist if something is true, first of all, and especially not if the statement or position is positive, like the Jews control the American media. In fact, saying Jewish people control the American media is triple non-anti-Semitic because Jews aren't Semitic, and as Joel Stein, a Jewish journalist who wrote for the LA Times, loudly proclaimed in his article, Jews totally run Hollywood, which he backed up with the names of the Jews who actually controlled Hollywood. And third, it's a positive statement, as Stein pointed out, by saying how proud he was of this truth. So let's talk about real anti-Semitism, not the fake anti-Semitism that the American media likes to talk about. Real anti-Semitism includes the Israeli military firing white phosphorus rockets into Palestinian villages in response to minor terrorist attacks, which could arguably be considered freedom fighting. White phosphorus weapons are internationally illegal when used against civilians because they burn the victims alive in the most grotesque manner possible. When a nation does not view a particular race as human, as the anti-Semitic Israeli government does not, it is far easier to commit war crimes against them. In addition, Semitic Arabs are often singled out in Israel for suspicionless and warrantless searches, while Jews rarely are. Israel is currently operating in an apartheid state, which is quite similar to South Africa 30 years ago and America before the Civil Rights Movement. According to a Human Rights Watch report, Israelis and Semitic Palestinians go to separate and completely unequal schools. Palestinian schools get a fraction of the funding Jewish schools get, and it shows up in the educational results. Israeli school textbooks depict Semitic Arabs as terrorists, primitive farmers, and refugees. Semitic Palestinians are often not allowed to live in the same apartment buildings, attend the same events, or even have the same rights to travel within Israel. In 2010, the Israeli cabinet approved a bill that would require all future non-Jews applying for citizenship to swear loyalty to Israel as a democratic Jewish state. This blatant and discriminatory bill was universally condemned outside of Israel as racist against Semitic Arabs, but gained much support from Israeli Jews. In Israel, it is against the law for a Gentile to marry a Jew. Amnesty International has come out and condemned their marriage policy as discriminatory towards Semitic Arabs. Under the citizenship and entry law into Israel, members of or sorry, citizens of Israel and residents of Palestine, Palestinian occupied territories in Palestine, can be separated, legally separated, meaning that Semitic Palestinian families can be legally separated. This blatant disregard for Semitic people is not just an Israeli problem, unfortunately, but also a Jewish American problem as well, which is evidenced in the way that Jewish Americans lobbied for the Iraq War, and why the anti-Semitic media rarely report the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi casualties. The rampant anti-Semitism in the media extends to the virtual blackout of the Israeli war crimes in Gaza. Now, even if Jewish people were Semites, which some still claim that they are, even though historical evidence proves otherwise, the labeling of people unsupportive of Palestine over Israel as anti-Semitic is just plain ridiculous because they're both Semitic, if that's the argument. It is also ridiculous to call an Arab anti-Semitic for being hostile to Jews, but then not reverse the labeling and call a Jew anti-Semitic for being hostile towards Arabs. Jewish Israelis are unquestionably against Arabs, as many of them admit in survey after survey, so they must be labeled accordingly.